Welcome back, everyone. We continue making our way through the book of Psalms. Coming this week to Psalm 69. Psalm 69. A rather lengthy one. And I want to take this one in a little bit of a different order. Normally, what I do is note the introductory material, some of the high-level observations about it, and then we kind of finish with reading it through. I want to do it a little bit differently. I want to read it through first because there's something really big about this particular psalm. And I want to read it through first before pointing out what it is, just to see if you catch it. As we're reading through, following along, see if you can note what it is that makes Psalm 69 stand out just a bit from others. One thing I will note, just very briefly, or two things, I guess by way of introduction before we read it through. Number one, authorship. It's ascribed to David, as again most of them are, but there's a little bit more to it than that. As I've noted before, a lot of the superscriptions that you find in the Psalms are traditional. You know, just like the chapter and verse divisions, they're added later. But Paul notes explicitly in Romans 11:9 that this is written by David because he quotes from it, and then it notes that David had written the psalm. So definitely written by David, but the occasion is unknown, right? There's no specific event or time in David's life to which we can tie this psalm, or really any clues that would point to any particular occasion. So that's one thing, written by David. The other one, I'll give you very first, but before we get into reading it, kind of a very high-level outline, because it's super simple. This psalm happens to shake out into two rather neat halves, the first 18 verses and then the second 18 verses, right? So 36 total, 18 and 18. The first half deals with the psalmist's suffering, and then the second half it deals with his plea for deliverance from and punishment of the enemy. Right, so kind of handy there, kind of neatly divided. If you want to break it down a little bit further, the first four verses in that first half deal with his complaint laid before God. 5 through 12, the cause of his suffering is his own zeal for God. Right, so he's suffering because he's faithful. And then 13 to 18, a call for help and deliverance in light of that suffering. In the second half, in 19 to 36, or rather within the second half, 19 to 36, first in 19 to 21, there's the conduct of his adversaries. So he talks a little bit about his enemies, what kind of people they are. 22 to 28, he calls for their punishment. A little bit of that imprecatory flavor that we've noted with many of the other Psalms, although overall not an imprecatory Psalm. 29 to 36, closing it out, his commitment to praise in view of anticipated deliverance. So he's faithful. He knows that God's going to deliver him, so he turns his thought to praise. Not terribly different from many other Psalms that we've seen. Okay, so with those things in mind, let's walk through the Psalm. Again, as we're reading it, be listening and pay attention and see if anything jumps out at you. David writes, "Save me, O God, for the waters are come in unto my soul. I sink in deep mire where there is no standing. I'm come into deep waters where the floods overflow me. I'm weary of my crying, my throat is dried, mine eyes fail while I wait for my God." Terrible circumstances, very, very descriptive imagery. Verse 4, "They that hate me without a cause are more than the hairs of my head. They that would destroy me, being mine enemies wrongfully, are mighty. Then I restored that which I took not away. O God, thou knowest my foolishness, and my sins are not hid from thee." Common refrain of David, right? We've mentioned many a time that David, he's described in the Bible as a man after God's own heart. And in many of the Psalms, he speaks of his own righteousness. And righteousness meaning right doing. But we've also noted many, especially in our Sunday morning class, we're going through David's life in detail through 2 Samuel. David is by no stretch of the imagination perfect, and he acknowledges such. Here's just one example, Psalm 51 probably being the best known. But here in Psalm 69:5, he speaks of the fact that he's foolish, that he's not perfect, that he has sinned and God knows it. How do you reconcile that with the fact that in other Psalms he speaks of his righteousness and the reward that he knows he'll have before God? It's the same for any of us. The ultimate answer, of course, is that those sins are ultimately not held to his account because he is faithful. But continuing on in verse 6, let not them that wait on thee, O Lord God of hosts, be ashamed for my sake. Let not those that seek thee be confounded for my sake, O God of Israel. Because for thy sake I have borne reproach. Shame hath covered my face. I am become a stranger unto my brethren, and alien unto my mother's children. For the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up, and the reproaches of them that reproach thee are fallen upon me. When I wept and chastened my soul with fasting, that was to my reproach. I made sackcloth also my garment, and became a proverb to them. In other words, his name becomes synonymous with reproach. And verse 11, I can't help but think we just this past Sunday spoke a little about Job, speaking of his Redeemer living. I get a little bit of that sense of Job here with what he's saying. They that sit in the gate speak against me, and I was the song of the drunkards. Right, so he's in dire straits. He's suffering, again, because of his faithfulness. And to the extent that everybody else knows about it, and he becomes the subject of songs and sayings and proverbs because it's going so badly for him. Continuing verse 13, but as for me, and as we're reading this too, like I said, we don't know the specific occasion. There are no specific clues given, but we've covered David's life in some detail these past months and in our Sunday morning Bible class, and you probably think of several times in his life that this could potentially fit. Continuing verse 13, but as for me, my prayer is unto thee, O Lord, in an acceptable time. O God, in the multitude of thy mercy hear me, in the truth of thy salvation. Deliver me out of the mire, and let me not sink. Let me be delivered from them that hate me, and out of the deep waters. Let not the water flood overflow me, neither let the deep swallow me up. Let not the pit shut her mouth upon me. The pit, Sheol, right? Death, the grave. Hear me, O Lord, for thy loving kindness is good. Turn unto me according to the multitude of thy tender mercies. And hide not thy face from thy servant, for I am in trouble. Hear me speedily. Draw nigh unto my soul and redeem it. And again, redemption, we talked about this past Sunday, being bought back. Deliver me because of my enemies. Redeem it. In other words, get me out of this. I'm in the mire, I'm in the deep, I'm in a terrible situation, get me out. Thou hast known my reproach and my shame and my dishonor. Mine adversaries are all before thee. Reproach hath broken my heart, and I am full of heaviness. And I looked for some to take pity, but there was none. For comforters, but I found none. They gave me also gall for my meat, and in my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. So his enemies abound, as is the case with many another psalm. And again, terrible situation. He's suffering. He has adversaries round about. He needs help. Let their table become, and here's a little bit of the imprecatory bit that I noted earlier. Let their table become a snare before them. And they, in other words, the things that are benefiting them now, flip the script and let it become a problem. And that which should have been for their welfare, let it become a trap. Let their eyes be darkened that they see not, and make their loins continually to shake. Pour out thine indignation, in other words, let them be blind and afraid. Pour out thine indignation upon them, and let thy wrathful anger take hold of them. Let their habitation be desolate, and let none dwell in their dens. And wipe them out utterly. For they persecute him whom thou hast smitten, and they talk to the grief of those whom thou hast wounded. And add iniquity unto their iniquity, and let them not come into thy righteousness. A little bit of an interesting thought there. I'm not entirely sure that I would agree with David on that one, but in other words, let them fall into a trap. Let them sin and then be punished for it. Let them be blotted out of the book of the living, and not be written with the righteous. it sounds a little bit like Jonah, quite frankly, speaking of the Ninevites. But I am poor and sorrowful. Let thy salvation, O God, set me up on high. I will praise the name of God with a song and will magnify him with thanksgiving. This also shall please the Lord better than an ox or bullock that hath horns and hoofs. Another common refrain that we find in Scripture. It was something that came up in the discussion famously between Saul and Samuel. The Lord doesn't delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, rather he delights in an obedient heart. Similar thought here from David. The humble shall see this and be glad, and your heart shall live that seek God. For the Lord heareth the poor, and despiseth not his prisoners. Let the heaven and earth praise him, the seas and everything that moveth therein. For God will save Zion, and will build the cities of Judah, that they may dwell there, and have it in possession. The seed also of his servants shall inherit it, and they that love his name shall dwell therein. Okay. Did you notice anything as we were reading through Psalm 69? I have to say that it's a lengthy psalm, right? I mean, 36 verses. It's a relatively long psalm, at least compared to some. They're certainly much longer, but compared to many others that we've encountered, it's certainly compared to the next one, Psalm 70. It's rather lengthy. But overall, as I'm reading through it, it's on the surface what I would call a fairly vanilla psalm. It's, he's in distress, his enemies are everywhere, he wants God to deal with them, he wants to be delivered, and he praises God. That's kind of a typical standard psalm, and all the way through it contains, again, in my personal estimation, rather typical language. Length aside, you could put it aside 30 other psalms and might be hard pressed to tell the difference. But again, that's on the surface. What stands out about Psalm 69? Let me read Brother Waycaster's the paragraph that he's written on it here, and then we'll note some more of the things in detail. He says, this was written at a time when the psalmist was suffering because of his faith in God. It speaks of some possibilities for that. It says, one curious feature of this psalm is the fact that, with the exception of Psalm 22, this one is quoted in the New Testament more than any other. That's the thing to take away from Psalm 69. You have a lot of, well, not a lot, but more New Testament references from this psalm than any other. Again, with the exception of Psalm 22. That one is quoted more. But as we were reading through this, it could well be that some of the phrases, some of the sentences, some of the verses as we went through, you kind of thought, that sounds familiar. I've heard that somewhere before. Likely so. Specifically, Psalm 69 is one that's often called a messianic psalm because a number of the things that are quoted are related to Jesus. Now, a couple months back, we had a sermon and talked a little bit about prophecy, and it's an interesting thing. Sometimes in the Old Testament, you come across things that are explicitly prophetic, forward-looking. It's like something is going to happen later, and this is what it's going to look like. Deuteronomy talking about another prophet that would be like Moses. It's like, okay, there's this thing, and later on we're going to be looking for it. Isaiah 7 would be another example. Isaiah 53. You get the sense that something is going to happen later, and here's something descriptive about it, something that you might be looking for down the road. Other times, you have cases where you wouldn't read it and think this is applying to something that's going to happen later. We just read Psalm 69 in its entirety, all 36 verses, all in the first person, all referring to the psalmist in his particular condition. Later on, you come to the New Testament, and we'll look at some of the references here, and the statement gets applied to Christ, even though in Psalm 69 it's clearly referring to the psalmist, not to someone else. But again, there's a lot of that. You have a lot of cases in the Old Testament where you read a text and you wouldn't understand it to be prophetic. Later on in the New Testament, it gets cited as prophetic and calls back to the Old. Hosea is another good example in Matthew when Jesus' family, Joseph and Mary, have to flee to Egypt in order to save Jesus' life from Herod. There's a callback to Hosea who talks about his son coming out of Egypt. Although if you go back and read Hosea, it's very clearly and explicitly talking about the Israelites being called out of Egypt in the Exodus. So that's generally the case with Psalm 69 as well. So here are some of those references. Psalm 69:4, you can compare with John 15:25. They that hate me without a cause are more than the hairs of mine head. They that would destroy me, being mine enemies wrongfully, are mighty. Then I restored that which I took not away. Jesus refers back to this part of Psalm 69 there as he's speaking to his disciples on his final night after they've had this dinner. And in John, you get this long speech, this long discourse. And this is amongst the things, this is in the context of when he's talking about the fact that they're going to have many enemies just as he had, and they're going to be persecuted as he had. Again, the psalmist here, David, speaks of his enemies. Psalm 69:9. This one is especially interesting. Verse 9 is quoted in John 2:17 and in Romans 15:3, each of them taking a piece. John 2:17 quotes the first part of Psalm 69:9. Romans 15:3, Paul quotes the second part of it, but neither of them quote the whole thing. The first part, for the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. This is in Psalm 69:9, the psalmist reflecting upon the fact that he's suffering because of his faith, because he's been such a zealous follower of God. It's now causing him problems. This is quoted in John 2 when Jesus overturns in a fit of anger, overturns the tables of the money changers of the temple, and then the disciples think of Psalm 69:9. Paul quotes the second part of it in Romans 15:3. The reproaches of them that reproach thee are fallen upon me. Verse 21, compare with Matthew 27:34, Matthew 27:48, Mark 15:23, and John 19:29. They gave me also gall for my meat, and in my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. An obviously related in that the New Testament context to what happens at the crucifixion. Again, here, part of what David is describing as the treatment that he suffered at the hands of his adversaries. Psalm 69:22 and 23. Paul refers to this in Romans 11:9 and 10. Let their table become a snare before them, and that which should have been for their welfare, let it become a trap. Let their eyes be darkened that they see not, let their loins continually be shaken. Here again, it's David referring to what he wants to happen to his enemies. Paul, interestingly, in Romans 11, this is within the context of his Romans 9 through 11, he talks about the fact that his fellow physical Israelites, the Jewish people around him in his day, have by and large rejected the gospel of Christ. They've rejected the New Testament. And in Romans 11 in particular, he deals with this argument that that they might make. Well, we're God's chosen people, therefore doesn't He owe it to us to give us salvation? And of course, Paul's answer to that is no. He discusses it at length. If a Jewish person is going to be saved, it's the same way that a Gentile is going to be saved. The gospel of Christ. That whole chapter, he makes that particular case, and again quotes this, speaking of his fellow Jews, fellow Israelites. And then the last one that I'll note, Psalm 69:25. You can compare with Matthew 23:38, and interestingly, Acts 1:20, let their habitation be desolate and let none dwell in their tents. In Acts 1, it's changed a bit and ascribed to Judas. Here again, it's the psalmist referring to his enemies. He wants them to be just utterly wiped out. The place where they live, their tent should be empty. No one's there because God's destroyed them. In Acts 1, it's changed a bit. It's let his habitation be desolate, let none dwell in his tent. And it's referred to Judas. So it throws back to Psalm 69, but changes it just a bit to refer to him. But that is Psalm 69 in a nutshell. Again, a rather lengthy psalm. Overall, just taken on its face, a rather typical psalm. I'm in trouble. My enemies are all around. Help me out, Lord, and concluding with praise. Fairly vanilla, fairly standard. It's in these specific cases as you read through it that you find all of these New Testament references, again, specifically with Jesus, but also some, again, by Paul and others, that kind of harken back and take some of the phrases, some of the sentences, some of the language from this psalm and use it with the New Testament context for other things. All right, that's Psalm 69. Lord willing, next time we're together, we will take a look at Psalm 70. Thank you very much for your attention.